Today we have a treat. One of our esteemed associate professors in history, Tamika Nunley, we're going to have a conversation about her recent book that is awesome. If you haven't read it, please do. The title of it is The Demands of Justice, Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia. Awesome book. Let me tell you a little bit about Tamika. And before I get into it, I'm going to go off script right away. And I hope you don't mind. I really want to dedicate this to an esteemed emeritus professor in the history department, Margaret Washington.
Absolutely.
Because Margaret Washington is probably forgotten more about 19th century history than I actually know. But she was a key mentor to me when I first came to Cornell, and she continues to be even her retirement. So Professor Washington, I know you're watching. I want to be dedicating this this evening or this discussion to you. Thank you so much. Tamika Nunley is Associate Professor of History and the Slander Family Faculty Fellow. Her research focuses on the history of slavery, African-American women, and gender history in the early republic in the American Civil War. She's written other books. Her first book, The Threshold of Liberty, Women's Slavery and the Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C. I used to be able to talk, but somehow that went away. We're going to get into this book. I've known Tamika for about 2 years now, I think it is, when she first came, and I was impressed with her from the beginning. I think the students here have a treat. We have a treat to have her because she's a scholar extraordinaire, and that's gonna come out in our discussion this afternoon. I think for those that haven't read the book, if you don't mind, I want to read a little bit about the book that was in a book review. This is a little review about it, and it kind of gives you a backdrop to what the book is about and how our conversation could go, because we're freewheeling it today. Yay! Okay, rarely does a book of legal history become a way of looking at the lives of enslaved and white Southern women. However, award-winning social historian and associate professor of history at Cornell, Tamika Nunley, in her book, Demands of Justice, Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia, wields an understanding of law, enslavement, and women's history in such a book, and it really does. I mean, one of the things, I'm going to just jump in there real quickly, the humanity you give women in the book is awesome, because so often we just see them as chattel, but you put a certain bit of humanity into it. That's just a little reflection real quick. Let me continue to read. By using sources like a wide variety of Virginia court records dating from 1779 to 1865, minute and other in the order of books from Early County, an executive paper from the state government, Nunley gathered information about enslaved black women and their court dealings in the colonial era to the end of the Civil War. That's a nice span. Black women charged by their owners with crimes such as arson, poisoning, theft, murder, and infanticide were remanded to a court of law to receive a hearing and trial. The conviction was final, and only owners of the state of Virginia could spare these women from punishment. Nunley examines clemencies, successfully demonstrating how the choice benefited enslavers and still punished their accused. So the book is it really brings out this whole aspect of these women as property and what they went through. And really that came through. And I just kind of want to reflect on this for a minute, because as I was reading through the book, the concept of Sankofa came to mind. I know you're familiar with that term. It's a West African term. Akan people have it, and it has a couple different meanings. In order for you to know where you are going to go, you have to know where you came from. And for me, as a person of African descent, it really helps me put things in a certain way of understanding the past. But I think even if you're not African American, you should still learn from it too, because after all, this is all our history. This is just not a particular race history. It will help us understand where we came from. And it made me think too, I was lucky enough to be on the advisory committee, the workforce advisory committee that advises the director of HR for the city of Ithaca. And I was a main author for a resolution that made Juneteenth a paid holiday for city workers. And what I did in that, and I see it in your book too, is teach about the history. Because that is so important, because I did not want this resolution just to be about a day off. You know, just like I know your book is a similar way. You wanted to demonstrate what these women went through. And one of the things I wrote, and it connects to your book, so I'm just going to read this real quick, not the whole thing. Whereas slavery was deeply embedded American institution and is direct contradiction to the nation ideals of freedom, and that comes through in your book. Because it's these contradictions that happen where you have people that confiscated the land, kidnap people, and enslave them at the same time. They espouse liberty and freedom, but it didn't happen. I go on. Whereas beginning in the late 15th century, African or African thoracic people were kidnapped and forced into slavery and shipped to the New World. In what is part known as Mafa, that's a Kiswahili word, and it means disaster, calamity, a terrible occurrence to describe the history and atrocities that African people went through. Whereas the term Black, African American, African diasporic people is used to include people of African descent who were born in the Caribbean, Central and South America, who at times are also enslaved in the United States, and at some point the slave plantations. This is where really I tie it in with your book. Whereas on slave ships, Blacks were packed by the hundreds in inhuman conditions and were contract diseases like yellow fever, malaria, smallpox, and where women and girls are subject to sexual assault at the hands of European crewmen. And this comes through in your book. This really comes true in the book in terms of how women were used as we could say, property. Now, with that said and done, you know, I can kind of go on and quote some stuff in the book, but I want to get into some questions, if that's okay. And by the way, at some point, we want to open it up to you, people here in the audience. We want you to engage. I'm the kind of dude, if you want to interrupt me, raise your hand. You got something you want to jump in there, just jump in there. If you get the feeling hits you, the spirit moves you, just come on in. You know, just, doors open. I want you a little bit, what motivated you to research and write this book? And how long did it take?
I think the thing that motivates me to write anything is just a passion for examining the Black past. I just think that so much can be gained from that. And for me, I started writing about slavery as a graduate student and as I was working on my first book, I kept coming across these legal cases involving enslaved women who were accused of these very violent crimes, which is quite different than a lot of sort of how the earlier historiography had treated the actions of enslaved women. Enslaved women were oftentimes seen as having resisted in these these indirect ways, right? But never seen as sort of overtly, right? Engaging in sort of violent resistance. And so I became very intrigued by these cases, but I kind of kept them, you know, in another document, in another Dropbox folder in my computer. And I said, okay, I'll get to this and I'll start thinking about these cases. And then I did. I started reading the historiography of early Virginia, the sort of creation of the law. I saw lots of really interesting, also very helpful, thorough treatments of the legal history of slavery in the South. And one of the things that I sort of became intrigued by was this question of justice and to what extent are early Southern jurists consumed or preoccupied with this idea of justice. And so what I found in that literature is that many historians argued that enslaved people, because they were given due process, were afforded some semblance of justice, and that early Southern jurists were preoccupied with this notion of justice. They cared very much about the integrity of the legal system. And I said, okay, right? That didn't sit well with me, because at that point I had written a book about slavery. I knew what slavery was, and I knew that justice was not my takeaway from my study of slavery in the South. And so I became very interested in these sort of very legal questions around why is justice inserted here? Why do historians interpret even clemency as a form of justice? And I think it's because when we hear that an enslaved woman has attempted to murder her enslaver, we might automatically assume, without having ever read any history books about slavery, that she's immediately going to be executed, right? And that's the assumption. And actually, that wasn't the case. A very strong number, a significant number rather, of enslaved women were granted clemency. And so it's because of this loophole in the law that many historians of particularly early Virginia began to argue that the early slave law was preoccupied with notions of justice. And so then I began to ask the question of, well, what is clemency, right? And clemency is not that you become free, or that you're completely freed of any charges of crime. The best case scenario, quote unquote, is that you would be sold to the Deep South, that you would be sold outside of Virginia. So then I sort of thought, if that's the best case scenario, then what actually does justice mean in the United States? And I kind of landed at this idea of that it was an expression of paternalism, right? It was an expression of how white Southerners saw themselves as moral stewards of the law, even as they had their own moral flaws in their own relationship to justice. What I also learned was that the law was scaffolded in such a way, not necessarily to offer equal protection of the law, but actually to sustain the financial incentive of slaveholding, right? And so if you were sold outside of Virginia because you were granted clemency, the enslaver or their family would be compensated by the state, by state coffers, in exchange, right? And so whether an enslaved woman was executed, sent, to the Deep South, or, remained on that plantation, that financial investment in slavery remained intact and protected by the law. And with that guarantee, justice could not coexist, right, with those incentives in the law. And so I kind of came against this historiography that said that this was really about justice, to say, actually, I think there's something else at work here, and perhaps we need to think differently about the kind of language we use around justice, and also think about our early sort of our reliance upon precedents, right, to move forward the law, and also to complicate the ways that we reify the law in American society. And so there is a way in which, when you deal with the law, even historians, you don't have to be a lawyer, even historians fall into this pattern, this insistence of upholding, right, the virtue of the law. But there's something about slavery that collapses all of that and forces us to ask very different questions about the origins of the early American legal system and its sort of persistent relevance even today.
The one thing I found fascinating in the book is the slave communities that you talk about. How does that work with regard to slave community, that they got so smart around that stuff? Because people had enough intelligence to challenge, to go through the legal system. So could you talk a little bit about the slave community and the laws and how they were able to basically defend themselves in court and all these other different things, and the different things that happened in those? Because this reminded me a lot, as I was reading through it, John Blassingame's book, The Slave Community. And it also reminded me of Linda Brett, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where she definitely gets into what the slave community. So could you talk a little bit about that in terms of how that influenced some of your ideals, especially when it comes around how these black folks, you know, especially the women, it's just really amazing, some of the things that they were doing. And I'll let you talk. I'm gonna stop.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Blassingame is a really great, you know, jumping off point, because Blassingame was a part of that generation that was asking very different questions about slavery, and about actually the Black experience and centering the Black experience and amplifying the voices of the enslaved. Whereas before, earlier scholars had really kind of focused on the system of slavery on a macro scale, and also thinking about sort of how sources convey what slavery is that are authored by enslavers, right? And so I think centering the community is absolutely essential, because a lot of the resistance that unfolds happens as a result of solidarity within the community. Now, I don't want to overstate that solidarity, right? I think that we can be romantic when we talk about community. There were fissures in the community, right? There were people who, you know, would actually expose some of the enslaved women and girls, you know, who were accused of those crimes.
Why is that?
You know, because, you know, enslaved people are very human, right? Like they have disagreements, they have resentments, right? Just like anybody else. And I think sometimes as historians, we have to resist, especially when we care about the voices of the enslaved, we have to resist kind of romantically imposing community on people who may not have been in community. But that's not to say that there wasn't, right? And so what is interesting is those moments of solidarity. They're powerful because the tremendous risks that they incur as a result, and the cost of solidarity, right? And so the cost of solidarity is that when you are working in alliance with each other, then you both are subject, right, to punishment. And we saw a lot of that in the book, where, you know, sisters were coming together and they were supporting each other and helping to poison somebody or helping to knock somebody out. Well, guess what, right? That those other sisters also had to sit before a jury that did not reflect who they were, right, in society. And so, you know, I've always sort of tried to caution against kind of how we portray and convey what community looks like. It's certainly there, and it's certainly vital to the survival of enslaved people over time. And also, it's very complicated too, right? It's complicated because people incur personal risk in order to be in community. And then some people just don't get along with the other person, right? Because they have beef, right? So that's also very much a real part of that experience. But to that end, I found it really powerful, right? And so in the late 18th century, there was a case where an enslaved woman who was pregnant, very pregnant, was working. She wasn't working fast enough, apparently, and her enslaver began to beat her. And another woman came and said, absolutely not. And then they both beat him, right? And then they ran off to a neighbor and said, hey, like, you know, this guy, like, she's with child, right? So they are asserting their own moral ideas, their own moral economy around right and wrong, even as the system of slavery does not allow space for that, right? And so they are forging that space at tremendous cost and risk to themselves. But yet this is an intellectual concept that they're contributing to our understanding of the past, right? That they are saying she's with child, right? And so what this tells us is that they have an ethics around how you treat pregnant women, that yes, the enslaver may not, you know, may not hold as a value to them, right? But they insist upon it.
Because that's the thing that bothers me so much with this institution we call slavery, is how inhuman, chattel these folks are. But these African or Black people, they were able to maintain a certain amount of dignity and respect. And I agree with you. There are divisions within a community. It's not monolithic, without any question. You know, we can get into that in a little bit, because I got a question about field versus house, but we'll get into that in a second. But the thing I think about too is the passing along of knowledge.
Yes.
That you write about in the book, especially when you talk about herbs and plants and how they were used, and also the paranoia that came upon these white folks who were like, oh no, she's poisoning me. And like they didn't have the DNA testing like we have now, and all this other kind of stuff. So I really believe there was a lot of paranoia that was going on because they knew this system is evil.
Yes.
And so anyway, I'll let you talk about it because I think that's such an important aspect of your book, the community and this knowledge. And many times this knowledge was not to be romanticized, came from Africa in terms of how to use plants, and not just for poison, but for healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, these women and girls were healers, they were poisoners, right? They were concocting some things, right? And a lot of it had to do with just their general knowledge of Virginia's landscape, right? And so they integrated indigenous knowledge around botanical properties, as well as European medicine and African medicine, right? And so it really was sort of a hybrid knowledge that they carried with them in ways that preceded American medicine, right? And so the American medical profession is sort of only just emerging during this time, whereas a lot of enslavers relied upon the enslaved women on the plantation for knowledge around healing, midwifery, and so forth. And so it's a very gendered labor, right? And this is why this knowledge production is very fascinating to me, because it's oftentimes the women who are serving as the cooks in the kitchen, right? And there has to be a level of trust established there. And so oftentimes in these cases, these women had been serving these families for many, many years, and then just one day, it just shifted, right? And then there's also the ways in which the community, both Black and white, enslaved and free, acknowledged the powers, the intellectual, right, the botanical powers of Black women. And one of the cases that has always fascinated me was an enslaved woman named Lovelace. She was an elder in the community. And there was a young woman who, and a young man who said, we want you to concoct something for us for the enslaver. And she's like, well, why? And so the guy says, I want to make him love me, right? Because he had been beaten excessively. And then the woman was like, I just want him to stop beating me. You don't have to love me, but he's got to stop beating me, right? And so Lovelace, the elderly woman, get some hair, get a little glass, get a little this, a little that, boom, boom. She's like, put it in your pocket. When you talk to him, just make sure it's in your pocket. And so he takes them to court. He's like, they're trying to kill me, right? And so, they are trying to convict, the enslaved woman and the younger enslaved woman and guy, and eventually, they actually do get charged with attempted poison, but it's Lovelace who made the poison, right? And so the enslaver says, oh, but Lovelace, don't even, she's all set. We don't want to touch her. We don't want anything to do with her. I'm all set. We'll just take these two, right? And so what's interesting is that, again, there is this social economy within the plantation system that recognizes, right, this knowledge, this power that people have within their own community that may not be recognized by broader society, but within the community and even within the enslaver's household itself, right, recognizes that you don't want to mess with Lovelace, because if you mess with Lovelace, something's going to happen to you that's unexplainable, right? And also that's very 19th century, right? It's it didn't take much to spook people in the 19th century, but Lovelace was somebody you just did not mess with, right? And she just was like, well, okay, well, let me know if you all need any more herbs and hair and things, and and so I think what really fascinated me about this book, even as painful as these stories were and horrific as many of them were, it gave me a glimpse into kind of just everyday interactions
Sure.
that sometimes we miss because we're concerned with these high-level legal questions, legal history questions, and conceptual ideas, and not kind of thinking about kind of people, right, and what it might have been like to be the daughter of an enslaved woman and for her to take you around the perimeter of the property and show you what this plant meant and what this plant can do, and to stay away from that plant and go take you a couple berries while you're at it, right? And so that experience is the thing that I became really interested in.
That sounds fantastic. I got just 2 more questions and we can open it up. One of them, it really gets around, you mentioned it earlier, but it's nice to come back to revisit the whole aspect of law and the hypocrisy. You know, and how this was really stacked up against these black folks and black women, where, as you mentioned earlier, they didn't have a representation of their peers. In many cases, as you write in your book, it was slave owners or people that were on these, and the way the laws were written. But the thing that really angered me was those that were executed. The plant owner got compensation for that.
Yes.
Talk about reparations. You know, this is, to me, that is insane, but it just tells you the backbone of the South and how it got built on this free labor, and they're going to get compensated because you're losing this labor. You don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of what you found?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that was astonishing to me that Virginia would pay, right, to compensate enslavers for an execution, right? And that to me showed a very clear, unquestionable commitment, right, to the financial institution of slavery and to the property rights of enslavers. And then also just how big the law is itself, not only in that particular era, but also to historians, and how we even write about the law is in this very romantic, reifying way. And I wrote this book actually during the pandemic.
Okay.
And everything shut down, and it was on my porch, and I was writing, and then George Floyd happened, and many of us were protesting, and we were out there, and I just kept thinking to myself, like, why are we out here? You know, what are we doing here? And I kept thinking, right, we're all out here because there's something insufficient about the justice system as it stands.
Sure.
To realize the justice that we are seeking here in this march, right, in this protest. And so one of the things that became clear to me was that the Black freedom struggle has been one in which people have always been making these kind of claims that don't always feel heard, don't always feel visible, to expand the scope and the reach of justice in our American legal system. And we just don't have institutionally, right, the value system that says that these people matter and what they think about the limitations of the law matters, right? And so this book was kind of an intellectual risk for myself in that I was saying that these women and their actions, while our common instincts is to criminalize them, right, and to deem them as deviant. What if they actually provided an intellectual history of other claims, articulations of justice? What if we took seriously the ways that they laid their life on the line to say enough, to consider what this law really does to people if we don't really look at it with a critical eye?
Well, I love how you bring out the aspect of what happened to women. It reminded me, which as you wrote in the last part of your book, Say Her Name. So the connectivity with contemporary is right there.
Yes.
You know, when you look at what these women went through at that time period in American history and what gone through now and how we don't talk about that enough.
Yeah.
You know, because I had one of my old friends who was a student of Professor Washington. She did a book about the lynching of Black women, for example.
Yeah.
So all these things happen to women that we need to identify, we need to talk about, because that is part of the story. It's a big part of the story. And I'm so happy you put them in the center. The last question I have is I always had an issue with some of the progressives when they would talk about the field slave and the house slave and how the house slave had it better. And I'm like, really? And I think that is such a misunderstanding of the system. And you really, in your book, debunk it. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because for those that don't know, there is always, and this happened during the Black Liberation Movement in the 60s, where it was like kind of a metaphor, but it's a false metaphor, in my humble opinion. So I'll just turn it over to you and stop talking.
Well, I'm not the first one to debunk this, right?
Okay.
And Thavolia Glimpf, who is a mentor of mine, when she wrote Out of the House of Bondage, she complicated this idea that somehow enslaved women who worked in the plantation household and not in the field had it better than those in the field. And she talks about that intimate violence that they experience as a result of working in the house. Now, skin color politics are real, right? And so we're definitely not going to discredit that. But when we think about...
Because they were related a lot to the plantation owner.
Yes,
because of the rape
absolutely.
that took place. But anyway.
Absolutely. And those plantation owners, everybody wasn't given, their children,
right.
Gifts and education and freedom, right?
Right.
And so, a lot of these people were actually monsters, right?
Yeah.
And I talk about this in the last chapter of my book. But, also, the degree to which you worked what I found in my book anyway, was that the degree to which you worked in the field or in the household did not dictate the chances of you working together or working in solidarity with one another, that this kind of imposed division between between labor. Also, labor fluctuated, right? And so this idea that there's a group of enslaved people who statically work in the house and statically work in the field is also not true, right? That people shifted roles over time, and so that kind of mythology is just not really representative of what was happening on the ground. But again, like I said, it does not change that there are sort of skin color politics that come with being biracial and, that shape different dynamics in the South.
But look who's setting the standard for that. Because it's about survival, unfortunately, and people capitalize on that. That's
absolutely,
kind of way I look
and
at
it's
that.
padded up with racial science,
Yes.
right? At the time, and so it's definitely not nothing.
It's
but
not.
But when you do look at some of these stories, it's not the story.
You know where you see that come out in the movie Sankofa? Because he does a really great job of showing an array of rainbow colors of Black folk and what they went through. But if you haven't seen it, it's a great movie in terms of the slave community and what happened from the shores of Africa to over here in the New World. I think maybe Sean or Wendy, do we have any questions from the people in the chat there? We do not. Oh.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
I noticed at the very beginning of your talk, I think that was part of Kofi's question a little bit about how long it took to write. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the sources you used, because it also caught my attention that you said you were doing a lot of the writing during the pandemic. So I just love to know more about that.
Yes, so it's very serendipitous. First of all, no good history gets written without librarians and archivists, right? And I give them love and my acknowledgments too. Like the Library of Virginia is probably my favorite place to conduct research, and the folks there are just so knowledgeable and also really generous with their willingness to help. So it started off as the chapter 3 was an article I had been working on. It took me 6 years to get it published, to get through peer review, and it was a very rigorous process. And by the time they got done with me, I thought I had a book. And so, but it was actually very serendipitous how I was able to do this. So I had collected so many sources just for that chapter, and then along the way, I was collecting extra sources as I was trying to, really enrich this chapter. And then December of 2019, my students, I was at Oberlin at the time, my students they went to reading period. And so I had like a week, and I was like, you know what, I should go should go back to Virginia and just collect the rest of everything. And so that's what I did. I spent the week, and that's why I said it was serendipitous. I don't know what made me think that. Like normally during reading period, I just want to collapse to the floor and not do anything. But I was like, I should probably collect the rest, and maybe I'll piece something together, along the way. And then I just collected 7,000 documents. I just took pictures and pictures and pictures all day for 7 days, and then I came home. We celebrated the holidays. We acted like the semester was going to start, and then March happened. And so then I homeschooled a little bit, and then got on the porch and, over the summer, and I was like, I should really start working on this because I have time. and while the feedback and criticism was fresh from that article, I felt like I had a lot to say. And so I just began writing. And so the article took 6 years, and then I think it took me 2 years to finish drafting the book.
So you chose Virginia because of the amount of resources that were at your fingertips? Is that why you chose Virginia?
Also, Virginia is this coveted slave state, right? It's the slave state. It's one of the oldest. Maryland and Virginia are the oldest slave states in the Union. But Virginia kind of holds this elite, this political elite legacy of having produced lots of presidents, of having been sort of the standard for slave law in other southern states. And so it was a really good case to think about the origins of slave law. And, it's still with us today, right? Sure. And so we actually still use slave law as precedent.
Gotcha.
And so this is not something that is disconnected to our current realities.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. She's coming with a mic for you.
Oh, right. So that are online. Yes. So I wanted to just stick with the question of sources for a second.
Yes.
And I'm curious to just hear you talk about how you read the sources and testimony, especially in this context of probably the single greatest possible asymmetry of power, in the courtroom. And so how do you read testimonies and get a sense of anything that possibly actually happened? Or do you even see that as being, possible? What do you take from your sources?
Yes, absolutely.
I love that question.
It's a great question. I started off actually with treasurer's receipts for compensating enslavers for enslaved women who were executed. So there are these very just kind of dry, technical documents that are associated with the state of Virginia and also the executive office. Then I started looking at petitions that were sent to governors saying that, hey, you got this story wrong. This enslaved woman was actually quite brutalized, right? And that was from white community members in Virginia. And that became very fascinating to me. And then I looked at some testimony. A lot of testimony doesn't become a big factor in the cases because enslaved people were not permitted to testify against their enslavers. But there were some depositions, and there was some witness testimony, right? So enslaved people could serve as witnesses for the enslaved people who were being charged. And so from that became very interesting content as well. And honestly, I'd say the single biggest factor in helping me read these sources is really just being trained in Black studies, right? To be able to kind of question just legal technologies and how they portray Black people and kind of calling them into question.
Could you give an example of that?
Just as something as simple as this, this young girl was mouthy. Well, I was like, well, what does that mean, right? I've been called mouthy before, right? And, just understanding how white supremacy works and also how Black studies really invites us to think about the epistemologies, the knowledge that Black people produce in ways that are not always acknowledged in the academy. And so it's that kind of training that kind of gave me at least a healthy suspicion of these documents that led to sort of the analysis that I built around it. Whereas I think some of my colleagues, as rigorous and as really smart as their analyses around legal history, the legal history of slavery is, there's something that's still just really aligned with kind of reifying the law that prevents them from reading the sources of sort of how might this otherwise also be interpreted, right? And so I think, I would attribute my reading, and I'm very transparent. Like I never think I'm saying the definitive thing, right? Like, and so to your point about like, what truth can you gain? Like, what facts can you really gain from this? What story can you really tell? And I'm very clear. Like, I'm like, look, I have a shard of paper here. We're doing our best, but perhaps, like I use perhaps a lot of times in this book because, I'm unsure, right? And I think like the whole book is really an invitation to converse with me and other historians about what could this be? Could this be something other than what we've just decided that it was? And I think that question is really interesting to me. And I'm hoping that scholars will continue to write about these same sources and come up with their analyses. I know there are other historians who are coming up with books that deal with these sources. Shannon Eaves, who's at the College of Charleston, is coming out with a new book about sexual assault and slavery, and she's using some of these cases too, right? And so I'm hoping that more and more people will write about it and that they will actually find deeper answers and probe deeper than I have. So, so if anything, I felt like it was really just kind of a vulnerable moment of being like, I actually don't know what happened here, and here are the possible scenarios, and perhaps could this have happened? And so, I'm hoping that other people will build on that, or even just move away from it and create something better.
Questions from the audience? We have a question over here, so you're going to need a mic.
Okay, hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. It's so fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. Okay, I have a comment and a question. My comment is that what you're saying about justice and the sort of pernicious effects of law, it really reminds me of the South African case where under apartheid, the state was so proud, and so many of the people who upheld the state were so proud that it was a legally bound, law-based system. So it really, it really resonated. And then question-wise, like Justine, I'm so fascinated by these sources. They're so tantalizingly rich and painful. I was curious, in them, do you have a sense of how often these women were being falsely accused versus actually, having committed crimes? Can you even tell, kind of like Justine was saying? And then the second question, do you think the women understood themselves as resisting? Like, or does that matter to you, or do you see it there?
I love these questions. Yeah. To what extent do these cases show that they've been falsely accused? Well, I think that poison, right, is a very slippery slope because it's very difficult to determine whether or not poison really happened, whether or not there was a motive behind it, and also whether or not it's just being in the 19th century and like reckless, right? So when you think about even the use of opium, right? Like they gave babies opium and like coal and all kind of stuff, right? And then wonder what was wrong with the baby, right? Did you try to kill him? Like, well, no, maybe American medicine did, right? And so there's like that intellectual slippery slope and also the legal slippery slope, the lack of DNA technology, right? And then also, right, this also emerges in cases of infanticide, right? Where, the ability of enslaved women to have a healthy pregnancy to term, right? It was very contingent upon a lot of different factors on the plantation, right? And there were certain conditions in which a viable pregnancy would have been rare because of the working conditions there. And then there are instances where, right, you do see, the enslaved population growing more because of reproductive labor that enslaved women and girls are performing. And so it became harder to determine, right, is the baby delivered stillborn? Is the baby, right, did the baby just not live because also of, SIDS, right? And so there are all these sort of modern terms and conditions that we now understand in American medicine, also with legal technologies, with science, that just was not there, right, in the early 19th century. And so to that extent, because of that reason, I imagine many enslaved women and girls were falsely accused of crimes.
But we also have to ask, is it really a crime? What is a crime? Because if you are defending yourself and something happens, is that a crime? I mean, you know,
So for them it was, right?
Yeah.
You know,
but
because
for others it may not. I think you talk about that double standard in your book as well.
absolutely, right. Black codes and slave law, you know, had a very different set of rules, right? Black people in DC couldn't fly a kite, right, in the early 19th century, right? And so they couldn't play cards. They couldn't assemble in, you know, groups larger than 5, right? And so the law was just different for Black folks, right? And so to that extent, you could not defend yourself. And so you know, it did not take much for them to be accused of crimes. But then I will also say that A, it costs money to litigate. B, members of the community, if they felt like a case was particularly egregious or really just kind of got it wrong, they would weigh in and they would petition. And that was really specific to the locale, which also made Virginia a very interesting place to study.
It's something you said in your question, too, that I really like when you talk about the South African law and the proudness. I think it could be applicable here, too. They're so proud of their judicial system.
Yes.
But in a sense, we're grateful because they were able to maintain these documents that we can come back and look at years. That's kind of a weird scope way to look at it, but to me, that's how we're learning about this, because they preserve this information for us, and so we can look at it in terms of what these women said in the courtroom and what people testified. I think, to me, that's real important.
And then I love this other question you asked about, do these women see themselves as resisting? It just depends, right? And so in the case of the Southampton Rebellion, right, these women saw themselves as resisting. They were like, yeah, we're going to ante up too, right? For, you know, and that last chapter is called Insurgency, where you kind of really get a sense that these women are very much intentionally trying to start a revolution, like they are trying to set stuff on fire, they're trying to take people out, right? Whereas I think leading up to that chapter, it's unclear, right? And it's unclear because their voices aren't as amplified, and because sometimes they're oftentimes acting alone. Sure. Whereas in the Insurgency chapter, they're acting as a collective and they have kind of executed a particular plan. And so that, it really just depends on the case. And resistance is tricky, right? Because I think it can be overused. But I think one of the things that's clear, particularly in chapters like the murder chapter and Insurgency, is like, you know, these people, you know, were really very clear. And some of these women were like, I just had enough of him and he had to go, right? You know, and one woman said, I just got too old for that. Like, you're right, you know, and so you get these little snippets, right? Where you're like, ooh, what was that, right? You know, and so I think that piece of it, you know, shows that there's more overt resistance. And whereas others are just really about just what it looks like to try to survive, and especially when I'm thinking about the infanticide chapter, right? What does it mean when you learn that you're with child, and you're enslaved? I can't even begin to imagine what goes through someone's head, you know, thinking about that. And that's something I'm actually still wrestling with. Like that chapter, I think haunted me the most. And kind of led to the work that I'm doing now, where I'm trying to look more into enslaved women's relationship to reproductive law, because I just felt like that was the one chapter where I was just like, okay.
That made me think, as I was reading the book, Tamika, how do you keep yourself safe? Because as I'm reading the book, there's times in which I have to step away.
Yes.
So I can't imagine what's that like as a researcher looking at this primary source documentation. How do you do that to keep yourself okay? Because this stuff is really, it's real. You know what I'm saying? It's real in terms of it's almost like you can feel the spirit, not to be romanticized, but it can affect you. You know?
Yeah. No, and I think I think for me, I call it scholarly kinship, right? So being in community with other scholars who are doing the same work. You got to have a group text, that you can text and say, you won't even believe what I found in the archive today, or could you believe this, right? And so and that's really what it is, right? Is having, and I tell my grad students all the time, like, you got to get a group text, where you can just go and say, like, wow, like, this really just happened, right?
Exactly.
Or I saw this, and what do you all think about it? And that's important, not only to just sort of unload and not bear it on your own, but it's also important intellectually to say, like, how do you write about this in a way that also acknowledges some of your own ethics around, what, how you look at these stories, right? And so I think it's one of these books that, there are going to be people who maybe like it, and there are going to be a lot of people who have a problem with it, because I'm drawing these connections to the present and thinking about kind of what the law doesn't do for us. And I think that's gonna rub some people the wrong way, and I have to be good with that too.
But we in a movement now where, as we all know in this room, where they want to teach that slavery was good for Black folk. That, they weren't slaves, they were laborers. So you're bringing that opposite connection, like you said. Your foundation is Black studies. And in Black studies, this is what we learn. We learn to challenge these concepts and these notions and these beliefs. And I think you do an awesome job with that, because that stuff that conservatism is on the rise again. I mean, I don't even know if it's on the rise. Maybe it's just always been there.
Well, yeah, I think it's always been there, right? I mean, it's, it goes back to those early questions in the slavery historiography, right? Where, what did slavery do for the enslaved, right? And so that notion to try to kind of absolve the nation of what slavery really was that impulse has always been there, right? And it goes back to kind of what we see as the purpose of history, right? Sure. So I have some students from my history methods class, we talk a lot about that. Is history designed to build sort of nationalist sentiment? Yes. Is it supposed to be consensus building? Yeah. Is it supposed to make us feel good about who we are? What is the function of history? And it's when you ask that question that you get at why people are committed to promoting this narrative that, slavery wasn't all that bad, or, and one of the things that I try to do with this book is to just get people to stop being so casual about how they talk about slavery and the enslaved. Yeah. That when you look at this history, that you look at it, you consider it, and you engage with it thoughtfully, on terms that recognize the humanity of the people who have had to suffer in it.
Yeah, because I almost wanted to open this session and say, we're going to talk about stuff that's uncomfortable. Because that's part of what you're doing. You're talking about stuff that people may not really want to read. They don't want to acknowledge, especially if you talk about sexual violence, you talk about exploitation of labor, you talk about free labor, all this stuff. I mean, these are uncomfortable things. Yeah. But this is the backbone of this country, in a sense. And I think you do a wonderful job of bringing those questions and making people like me think even more about this. Like, as a librarian, I'm thinking about what supporting things that I'm gonna, because the one thing I love about the book when you read it is the references you give all these different authors and historians as you read it along the way. It's like, I had to stop myself from like going to my bookshelf and pulling the book off and like, okay, let me check that out right quick.
Citation is a love practice.
Oh man,
right?
You talk about it,
And one thing that made me the most excited about this book is that so many of my peers had just come out with books about Black women's history, and I had a chance to really amplify their work. Deirdre Cooper Owens, Vanessa
Kelly
Holden.
Cross,
Kelly Gross, yeah, and she's an Africana alum.
She's
yes.
an alum here. You know, I was so happy
she's going to be
see her
delivering our
name.
Beckers this year.
All
yeah.
right.
So, but Kelly Gross, Vanessa Holden, Jessica Marie Johnson, Deirdre Cooper Owens, Mary Hicks. I mean, so this, citation is a love practice for me.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome. We got a few more minutes left. I mean, I don't want to call on people in here that I know, but do you have some more questions? Because this is like a Tamika Nunley.
Margaret, we don't know if you were listening earlier, but we dedicated this talk to you.
Yes, we did.
We dedicated this talk to you.
Yes, we did.
Yes. We know you were in the carol.
Oh, we knew. I saw your car in the driveway, so I know she's in town. I told him, you've forgotten more about 19th century history than I know. Good to see.
Virginia is interesting because, of course, it's the first colony, right?
Yep.
And back in the day, we used to, in graduate seminars, have a discussion about the chicken and egg argument, which came first, a construction of racism or the need for labor.
Wow.
And one of the things about Virginia that's fascinating is, I can't remember the author, but the book begins with a chapter called The Unthinking Decision. And one of the things that he developed was the construction that the first Africans who came, the first 20, who came in 1619, some of them ended up landowners. And how that relates to women is that there's a book that was done, I think it's called Mine Own Ground, by one of the authors' name is Ennis, and it's about what somebody called Antonio a Negro, who's the one of the first 20 who actually ends up owning land in Virginia. And what's fascinating about it is Antonio dies and he leaves his, he's got quite a bit of property. He leaves that to his wife. And the big question for me was always, okay, how is she going to be treated? How is she going to hold on to this land? And of course, people began to encroach on it, whites, after he dies. And she actually goes to court. And to show you how things change, she is actually recognized in court. She doesn't get the land back, but she is treated, I dare not say like a gentlewoman, but she's not treated like a slave. Of course, she's not a slave, but she is a black woman. And so they listen to her arguments and they entertain it. And she loses the land, but ultimately she and the family move to Maryland and they own land. But there's a very interesting story about the progression of slavery. And Virginia is a prime example because of a lot of the points that you raise. And it becomes, sadly, the state with the most, even though agriculture leaves, becomes the state with the most enslaved people in it, and becomes a slave breeding state.
Yes.
And so the role of women in Virginia in slavery it's a progression and it's also a tragic story. In a way, it's sort of the beginning of the tragedy, and that's why what your book is so important because of the chronology of criminalization of enslaved black women, and you can extend that to black women. You don't just have to say enslaved.
Yes.
And so congratulations. And I had to come because you spoke last March, and I was in New York City, so I missed it. So I had to come to this.
Thank you for being
Thank
here.
you, Professor Washington. We're coming on that hour. We
do have one
we have
question
one more?
from the online
Oh,
audience.
let's go for
wonderful.
it. Go for it, Sean, or whoever it is, Wendy, I guess is
So this is about the dedication to your in your book.
Oh, yes.
And can you say the name for me so I don't have
yes,
to pronounce it?
Evolia Glimpse.
Yes. So the question is about what role she played in the making of your fabulous book, and what did she mean to you as a scholar?
Woo! Oh my goodness, I won't cry. Thavolia Glimpf, as I mentioned earlier, came out with this book that really debunked this notion that enslaved people who worked in the household were sort of holding this position where they were shielded from violence and exploitation. Right? She shows that it's its own kind of exploitation and violence. And she does this after a generation of historians, women historians, kind of make this argument that there was a sort of feminist alliance between enslaved women and white mistresses. And so what she does that's really fabulous is that she took the very same sources that these historians used and said, actually, no, like, you know, they were getting beaten, they were getting burned, they were maimed, they were, you know, and just her very close, careful reading of the sources, and just even how she develops her analysis over the course of her books has just been such a model for me. But she's also just been a generous mentor. She served on my dissertation committee, and I was at the University of Virginia, and she was at Duke. And she agreed to be on my committee, even though she was at a different school. And ever since then, she has just been really a guiding light for me. And also, I just admire her so much, her kindness and her generosity. And I can only hope to be as kind and generous as she was to me, to my graduate students, and to generations after me. And I just, you know, along with her and also with Margaret Washington and other folks, I just am, I just have such an appreciation and gratitude for what it must have been like to be a historian when they were writing their first books. And I just have such tremendous respect for the ways that they've made my role as a historian, and even just my position here at Cornell even possible, right? I'm getting teary-eyed, but I just, when I think about Black women historians, it's to me just really humbling to be a part of this tradition. And we have a tradition, not only in the kind of work we produce, but in how we see one another, we acknowledge one another, and we hold each other up, you know, during times when it gets very challenging. And so to me, it was an honor to be able to dedicate my book to her. She has meant so much to me, and I wanted her to be able to see it. You know, I didn't want to wait. You know, I was like, I wanted her to see it. I wanted her to read it and look at it, and let her know how much she has meant to me and to my generation of historians who just continue to be nourished by her scholarship.
Well, I'm so happy you did that, because I have a philosophy. That's why we dedicated this to you, Professor Washington. We want to give you flowers while you're here, you know, because that is so important in terms of what these women have done in terms of being trailblazers.
Yes.
You know, I mean, seriously, I mean, I look at you historians as a librarian, you know, you mean so much to me in my career in terms of trusting. And I remember working with Professor Washington, and when you did that course, Black in Film, and how you relied on me to get resources. I said, she's relying on me. Oh, she didn't make a mistake. But those mentors mean a lot, because they help craft who you are, and you're learning from it. But the fact that they open up their arms and they believe in you,
Yeah.
and now you're passing that on to the next generation, I think that's awesome.
You know, it can be very alienating, you know, being in the historical profession. And I think knowing that other people have experienced it, understand it, and see you, I think is really what keeps us all going, that's right? Awesome. And I remember when I first got the job here, I went and I met with two people. I met with Margaret, and I met with Kofi.
Oh, I thought she was going to say Carol Boyce Davies, but that's okay.
I met with Carol Boyce Davies too afterwards, and you know, and I just like those meetings gave me life, and I was just like, I know it's going to be good. It's going to be.
Oh yeah.
Be good here.
Well, we know talent. What did they say? Game, no game? We knew you were you're awesome. We know that. You know, do we have any questions from the audience in here? Mary, should I call on you? Are you okay? Okay. You just listen. As an archivist, how does this hit you though? Because you've done so much in this community as far as archival work at the History Center. Does this resonate with you at all in terms of what Tamika's been talking about?
The 7,000 documents resonates with me for sure. That to find anything, it takes so much digging.
Yeah.
I know there is I think there is a lot of material about the Underground Railroad locally in a particular collection, but it is so vast and massive a collection that no one has ever tried to sift that information out of it. And I think about it, and it's a project beyond I'm not doing it this lifetime. And secondly, I'm thinking about, I had a friend who wrote a dissertation, a paper on witchcraft trials in Virginia.
Yes.
And I'm mostly about white women, but I'm comparing what she said about the courts and stuff to what you said. And
Nice.
Yeah.
I've got to reread her paper and look at it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. You got one more over here? We having a party in here. I like
Yes, I love this. We're creating community here. Should we meet again next week, this
know what I'm
time, same place?
I just had a quick comment. Speaking of what when you talked about the dedication, did you read or hear Deborah Gray White's comments at the Berks Conference of Women's Historians this year? Because she talked about the history of Black women in the profession. This sort of got overshadowed by.
It got tough there, yeah.
Yeah, it got her comments though. Yes. But what she said beforehand, before the things that were said afterward, she was talking about this history of what it meant for Black women to enter the professions and the double burden of entering history, because it also meant to grapple with Black women's history, meant to grapple with histories of sexual violence and the reproduction of labor power in America in the context of departments of white scholars and the potential for the reification of this assumption of Black women's hypersexuality. Sure. And it was just a really, I thought, a brilliant analysis of this kind of how entering history was different from entering the sciences or literature, any of the other kind of fields because of this particular history. So it was making me think about that as you were talking, because I thought it was really too bad that those words got overshadowed, what she was talking about Black women in the profession because of the other piece. But I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much a part of the process, right? Because when you go through tenure and promotion, people are reading your work, they're engaging with your work, and they get to determine whether or not this work is worthy, you know, of you becoming promoted, right? And so you do become subject to sort of a particular reading of Black bodies, A, and also B, a particular reading of whether or not your work is rigorous or not, right? And worthy of promotion to tenure, right? And so those politics are very, very much still with us, right? Even when I talk about the politics of publishing and peer review and what it took to get it through, I don't know if this could have been a first book, right? In some ways, it kind of had to be a second book because of some of the intellectual risk that I took with it. And so there's still a politics there, right? And we certainly, as a historical profession, are not as diverse as we like to think we are, right? We still have a ways to go. So, yeah.
And you have a major press that published your book too, which is, I think, equally as important. So that tells you about what they believe in or in terms of the scholarship that's important. Get the book. Get the book. Okay, get the book. We, I don't know, we coming to an end. What time we're supposed to end, right? At 5:30? Okay, because I have another event over in Africana. I have to remember what time it starts. I don't know, I got to set up, but I'm not worrying about that. I'll get there when I get there. I get there, we'll get there. We have a book at the end of all this, when we expanded all the questions, we have a hardback copy that the library owns. We would love for you to autograph that at some point. And I have my copy that autograph. So we want to give people opportunity, haven't spoken yet, that want to say something. You know, I might get like my old professor, Dr. Beckworth, and call on you. Actually, I did that already. I might do it again. It's like power, man. I love it. Thank you.
I wondered if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about the work you said you're doing right now about the history of reproductive
nice.
law or
Yes,
health
yeah.
related.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
a timely research project now, especially with the Roe versus Wade.
Well,
decisions,
to be honest with you, right? There's so many other scholars who have been doing this work really well. Dorothy Roberts is one of them. Michelle Goodwin, Jennifer Nash, Deirdre Cooper Owens, right? Who pioneered the history of gynecology and slavery. And so, for me, I became sort of interested in building upon that chapter that I wrote about infanticide and abortion, because I felt like there was more there. There was more that I was seeing in the records about just the complications of birth. I was also interested in what does mothering look like under the system of chattel slavery, and how does Black women's relationship to reproductive law and to American medicine shift over time. So it's kind of a longue durée project that I'm working on, focused on the 19th century, focused on Black women from the entire United States, from different regions, and writing in more of a narrative format to think about what would it have looked like, right? And so I'm looking at breastfeeding culture in the plantation, looking at midwifery culture on the plantation, but also outside of the plantation, and thinking about sort of how reproductive law changes or does not change over time in relationship to Black women and girls in particular. And so I see myself as really just trying to join a conversation that actually already exists and is already really well developed, just really to enhance my own understanding, and also really centering Black women's sort of own creation, their own creation of ideas about their bodies. And so been really interested in sort of how do they think about breastfeeding? How do they think about giving birth? And what I find is a lot of varied responses. Some women, Black women are not interested in becoming mothers at all. And a lot of, for various reasons that may not be answerable through the archive. And then some find great joy in moments that they steal in breastfeeding from hard labor, right? And so I'm interested in those stories, and that kind of came from the work that I had done in this book.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Give yourself an applause, and also Tamika. You know, she did a wonderful job.
Thank you for having me.
I hope we get one of these if on the way out, just like, that we did right. But I want to thank, and again, this is the last one in the series, and information is going to come out when we start up again in the springtime. And just to give you FYI, these chats and the stats, we feature faculty at Cornell who have published books, and we're adding it to the collection. So we're proud to have your work of art as a part of our collection, and we're gonna promote it as best we can, even beyond this day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tamika. Thank you, everybody.